Ontario's education system is in real trouble, and parents have definitely started to notice. This year, in September 2024, teachers were caught taking elementary kids from several schools across Toronto, and I think some as early as 8 years old, to a pro-Palestine protest without parental consent. Now, the parents were told it was an environmental field trip with something about Indigenous water quality issues, which seems fair enough, but that's not what it turned out to be. Now, after huge public backlash, Ontario Education Minister Jill Dunlop promised to address political bias in schools. Now, parents are fed up with their children being dragged into ideological conflicts, and Dunlop's words appeared to signal a shift towards accountability and fairness. Only Jill swiftly changed her tune when she appointed career radical Patrick Case to investigate the board. She went from addressing political bias to investigating Toronto District School Board's field trip policies. Why the sneaky switcheroo? Did she think we wouldn't notice? Does she think we, the plebeians, are just too stupid to do their due diligence? I believe that the answer to this question, we need to look more closely at Pat Case and his long, radical career history in Ontario's education. Now, in part one, I went into detail about Patrick Case's career history and how his far-left radical politics shaped his early career at the board. Go check that out. And today, in part two, I'll be looking into why Patrick Case would have an incentive to avoid substantial scrutiny related to the political activity at the Toronto District School Board specifically. I thought this was going to be a two-part series, but there's just too much information to share, and I think it's really important to share it. So I believe there's going to be 3 or 4 parts to this series. Now, before we dive in, it would be really, really, really helpful to get this in front of the eyes of Jill Dunlop. And to do that, I need to get loads of views. So if you could click like on this video, it'll help the algorithm. And if you're not subscribed and you want to see the next one, please feel free to subscribe. Okay, so let's dive in to expose the radical ideologues that have taken over Ontario education system. Let me take you back a little bit. Back to Tim McCaskill's book, Race to Equity, written in 2005, where he celebrates the progress, I suppose, from the radical educators who infiltrated the Toronto District School Board between the 1970s and the 1990s. So if I take you back to that book, in the book, Tim McCaskill describes how Patrick Case, through his influence in the race relations committees over the years, gave rise to develop what was called at the time the Equal Opportunities Office, what appears to be an office that is rooted in the far-left ideology of these radicals. And I guess you could say the first equity department at the Toronto District School Board in the 90s. Part of the responsibilities of this office, Patrick Case gave himself, is to create staff training which is aligned with the political ideology of these radicals. So that those are policies like hiring policies to do with sex disparities or gender disparities, or anti-racism training, so on and so forth. But let's just go over again, just very quickly, what DEI today really is. So the DEI, the current manifestation of the identity-based grievance policies rooted in the far left and socialist concepts, really is what was called equal opportunities as at the time is now really referred to as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it is just a manifestation of the same sort of identity-based grievance politics. Now, I'll give you my personal favorite description of equity, which some people call equal outcomes, but I like this description. So equity is an administered political economy in which shares are adjusted so that citizens are made equal, including shares of social and cultural capital. I think this describes it even better. It's taking the socialist concept of property and the redistribution of property, but in this case, we're talking about social and cultural property being redistributed so everybody is equal. And so that is essentially the definition of communism. And diversity and inclusion are really just centered around this concept of equity. So in today, the model includes other kinds of cultural capital. So that can include the obvious, the ethnicity or race, the gender, sex, sexuality, things like that. But today with intersectionality, you get other kinds of property, which include maybe body size or mental health status and so on and so forth in that matrix of perpetuator, victim oppressor intersectional wheel. This ideology always views any kind of disparities between groups as evidence of oppression itself. You cannot question this. If you question that any disparity comes from some level of oppression, you are essentially a racist or a sexist or a bigot or whatever other term is being thrown in your direction, because these are considered huge taboos and nobody wants to be accused of these being these taboos. So this equal opportunity office that Patrick Case was involved with in the 1990s was a sort of proto-DEI office and had in its fetal development some of these DEI ideas that we see today. And at the time, in the 90s, critical race theory went from radical leftist scholars into development of policies and opened up those ideas to be implemented in institutions. Ideas from Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, which we see in the pedagogy today in school. This was all the buzz at the time, and Patrick himself, being of that ilk, he was a radical leftist himself, and he was a guy looking for ways to advance those kinds of racial politics. And so these ideas were perfect. One of the things that Patrick was involved in are projects like a document called Challenging Racism, which was a teacher training designed to produce so-called change agents. And we know that change agents are just another word for people who transform societies, or people who become radicalized themselves and then become activists for the cause or allies for the cause. And then Tim McCaskill states in his book that this kind of training was explicitly designed to be confrontational. It was not neutral. It was meant to make people feel uncomfortable so that they could critique themselves or self-critique and critique the system and become those change agents. Again, a new way of talking about that, a new way of describing that is when you see anything that's talking about disrupting and dismantling the system. And again, you can see that all over the education system today. It is a form of, if you're not with us, you're against us. It's very binary, black and white thinking. And it looks like it was quite effective. So shaming people, as it turns out, is a really good way of manipulating people. It's career-destroying stuff, a very effective manipulation tool. And in his book, McCaskill says, and I quote, "The boundaries between student advocacy and curriculum were deliciously vague, leaving them room to maneuver." So it seems that they were quite happy to turn schools into leftist socialist engineering camps that serve the interest of the ideology. Hardly a neutral political act. Okay, so let's fast forward several years to 2017, when Patrick he accepted a job as Ontario's first assistant deputy minister in the newly created Equity Secretariat in the Ministry of Education. I don't know this for a fact, but I think this role was created for him in the same way that the Equal Opportunities Office was created for him to push this ideology forward. It seems pretty likely given the fact that it's happened in the past. And in his role under the Equity Secretariat, he did have experience investigating other school boards for ideological purposes. And I came across 2 reports, which I don't have time to go into here, but I'll show you these reports. One of them was with the York Region District School Board, where there was controversy over some comments a teacher made about Hamas and radical Islamism. Obviously, they were called racist over that. And then another one was at the Peel District School Board, where they found evidence of racial disparities, and obviously used this as a platform to push more anti-racist policies forward. Now, anti-racist is just an ideological term, following their ideology. But the interesting thing about the Peel board is that Colleen Russell-Rawlins, who would later on become the director of the Toronto District School Board at the time of the pro-Palestine protests, I guess you can call it, she was at the board at the time. She was working with Patrick Case, and so they definitely have a relationship working on anti-racist policies together, or pushing them onto the school boards. Now, those reports definitely deserve a lot more scrutiny, but I don't have time to go into those today, but feel free to read them and you'll see exactly what I mean. On the surface, you could see that Patrick Case did have experience investigating school boards. He did look like maybe a good candidate to investigate yet another board. Perhaps the Education Minister Jill Dunlop, fresh in her role at the time, hadn't been there very long, assumed that he was competent and didn't look too deeply into his past or into the details of the kind of investigations that he pursued. If she had looked more deeply into Patrick's case, she might have found all of the disturbing evidence that I found just by Google searching. I'm sure she has a lot more evidence, a lot more reports that I don't have access to at the Ministry of Education. But let's talk about a specific and very disturbing link that I found between Patrick's case, Colleen Russell-Rawlins, the recently ex-director of the Toronto District School Board, the TDSB, and the death of a beloved school principal called Richard Bilkszto. In July 2023, news coverage of the tragic death of Richard Bilkszto made international headlines. He was a beloved career educator with many decades of experience working in Canada and the USA, and he was subjected to what can only really be described as horrifying public shaming and abuse by mandatory TDSB anti-racism training under the governance of Colleen Russell-Rawlins. Richard's treatment during these training sessions went as far as accusing him of white supremacy, and this led to his eventual suicide after experiencing years of intense mental distress caused directly by this training. And I would go as far as to say as Patrick's case's involvement is at least partially responsible for the death of Richard Bilkszto, and let me explain how. Under Case's direction, the Ministry of Education decided to boost funding for far-left extremist program under the lauded name of Equity. But that includes programs designed to redistribute the shares of racial, sex, and sexuality-based categories known today as intersectionality. Now, remember what I said earlier about equity? It's an administered political economy in which shares are adjusted so that citizens are made equal, including shares of social cultural capital. So Patrick's main interest here is racial capital. So his equity department funded confrontational, not neutral, anti-racism staff training. The same kind of training that was devised many decades earlier. Now, early socialists found pretty quickly that people don't tend to give up their property so easily. And so they need to create ways to take it from them. And for intersectional social justice warriors, property is not necessarily your house, but your immutable characteristics, such as your sexuality or your racial identity. So non-compliance with equity-based discrimination on the basis of that identity has to be dealt with. Now, Colleen Russell-Rawlins and Patrick's case did work together at the Peel Board to collect basically questionable race disparity metrics. They had a shared interest in using their positions to influence and to advance their own race-based political ideology into the education system. When Colleen moved to the TDSB as director, she received funding from the Equity Secretariat led by Pat Case for so-called anti-racism training rooted in critical race theory, which is highly confrontational and politically biased, and one could say is historically revisionist. She used that money to hire a consulting firm that aligned with this highly divisive ideology, and that institute was KOJO Institute, ran by a lady called KOJO Tapes. The training that KOJO Institute delivered to the staff at the TDSB, which was mandatory by the way, rewrote and manipulated historical facts accusing Canada of being an inherently racist and white supremacist country. Now, Richard, like I said, he worked in the USA and Canada, and so he quickly picked up on the revisionist history here. And he very gently in the training pushed back on this idea, stating that the histories of both countries are quite different, and Canada wasn't involved in a lot of things that KOJO Tapes was accusing Canada of being involved in. Canada was not, in fact, what KOJO Tapes was portraying. Now, KOJO Tapes was recorded repeatedly berating and shaming Richard in front of all of his colleagues for the crime of politely disagreeing.
It's you. You are the 600 people, 200 at a time. We painstakingly went through 4 weeks of 200 people at a time so that you all would know and have heard this exact conversation, and that someone would start to live the anti-racist leadership that you know. Which one of you will it be? Which one of you will it be to do it and then say to the super, to the AD, to the D, you know what I'm saying, right? Associate director, director's office. You made me sit through 4 weeks and now you're not backing me on this thing. Who is going to be brave enough to do it? Which one of you? right? Don't look at me. I'm telling you what the facts are, the truth is, and what the problem is. I'm telling you even the pathway to the answer. Are you going to do it? And this is, so it's a really, to Bruno's point, it's actually really ridiculous. Like, all 600 of you will have heard the same thing. What are you going to do with it, right? There's nothing higher than you. You are 600 of the highest ranking staff in TDSB. There's nothing on top of you. Your board has been trained by me. There's nothing stopping you. I'm asking you, the community's asking you to go for it. And if you're not going to go for it, be honest about why not. And then to the senior leadership that are present, these are folks that are saying, hold me accountable. They're begging to be held accountable. That's what I'm hearing. They're saying, I don't want to do this anymore. Now I need something to change. So they're begging senior leadership to hold us accountable. Will senior leadership do it? These are the questions, but that has nothing to do with me, right? It really doesn't. Richard, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make a comment about the Canada-US thing, and I have a little bit of a challenge of it. I did my student teaching in the US and have spent a lot of time in the US. And to say here, honestly, that Canada is not a more just society than the United States is, and we talked about facts and figures. I invite everyone here to do some research, and you look at things. Yeah, absolutely. And look at things like education, and look how more you think about a system we have in Ontario where every student is funded equally. You go to the United States, they're funded based on their tax base, right? And I see you're shaking your head, but I taught in Buffalo.
What I'm saying, sir, is that why I'm shaking my head is that it absolutely matters what community you live in Ontario.
That's not what I said. What I said was...
I'm not arguing with what you said. Yeah. What I'm saying is, because I'm talking about the principle of your point. Yeah. It's not about what you said. This is not a court of law. The principle of your point is that you can base it on, well, they have this tax system, and that's true. What I'm saying to you is that what racialized people experience in this province is that it absolutely matters where you live. So the fact of the tax system is not untrue. What you're saying is not untrue, but how it's lived out in Ontario is not as you say, is all I'm saying, is that the Jane and Finch kids are not having the same experience as the Forest Hill kids. They're just not. And that's despite our equal laws. So in that way, it's worse because we have fake equality, or in the name of that equality, kids are still experiencing systemic inequities. So that's the point.
I understand when I hear what you're saying, right? However, I think to ignore that fact, right, that we talked about here about, capitalism, socialism, we're very happy here. We have a public education system where everyone is funded the same way. It's not like that in the United States. We have a healthcare system here where everyone has access to healthcare. It is not the same way in the United States. So to sit here and say, all honesty, we're talking about facts and figures, and to walk into the classroom tomorrow and say, Canada's just as bad as the United States, I think we're doing an incredible disservice to our learners. Disservice to our learners. And again, that's what I want to say that, right?
Thank you so much. Right. What I'm finding interesting is that in the middle of this COVID disaster, where the inequities in this fair and equal healthcare system have been properly shown to all of us. I mean, so it's just so what's fascinating is, and this is why we're in the place that we're in, is that you think, so we're here to talk about anti-Black racism, but you and your whiteness think that you can tell me what's really going on for Black people? Like, is that what you're doing? Because I think that's what you're doing, but I'm not sure. So I'm going to leave you space to tell me what you're doing right now.
Exactly. I just wanted to make the point. You were talking about the United States, and I just want to do a comparison. And as I said, you talked about facts and figures, and listening to the facts and figures. And I think if everyone here looks at the facts and figures and all kinds of studies, and you will see we're a far more just society. We have room for improvement. Absolutely. Are we racist and everything? Absolutely.
Richard, this is Andrew from KOJO Institute.
Yeah.
Just to back up everything that Keek has been saying, we're not here to compare. We're not here to say this is worse than the next one. And listen, we hear what you're saying, but facts and figures, who did these studies, right? Fair to whom, just to whom? A Black or Indigenous student in the TDSB has the same access to education as a white student, but they don't have the same outcomes, right? Disproportionately affected by streaming, in-school suspensions which are not tracked by the ministry appropriately, all kinds of other metrics. So I hate to disagree with you in this forum, but it's just not relevant what you're bringing up. And unfortunately, the experience of Indigenous, Black, and racialized students in the TDSB, probably in whatever school you lead, are just not good enough. And that's just the reality. So I think if we want to be an apologist for the United States or Canada, really isn't the forum for that.
Thanks, Andrew. We're going to move forward towards the end of this. What I would say is the teachable moments happen all around us, and as long as we are stuck in the yeah butness and not in the what is it that I don't understand or I don't see here, then it's because what I want to note is you have people around you who are Black and well-informed and well-educated and have as much as experience or more that have to deal with that kind of interaction. Y'all aren't going to get far. Y'all need to, part of this work is listening to Black people. That has to be a part of it. And really, and if you don't understand what's being said, then ask questions. But when people come with a particular tone and narrative and attempt to shut down the grace that the Black community is showing us by even bothering to tell us, we're shutting down the opportunity to learn better and different. That's what I would say. So, what is not your personal experience, remember, as white people, there's a whole bunch going on that isn't your personal experience. It will never be. You will never know it to be so. You will never know it to be so. But so your job in this work as white people is to believe and if what you want is clarification, ask for that. Truly, in truth, not with the foot in the but I'm going to tell you how you're wrong. It's the help me understand further, please, because I actually don't know. And so I think that one has to really question a number of things. I think this was a profound and appropriate teachable moment. I want to jump right in, if we can. Excuse me. Most of you came through classroom work in terms of how you got where you are now. And so I hope you can appreciate it when I say that it is rare that when teaching something that you actually get a real live example of the concept unfolding right before everyone's eyes and ears. And we had that privilege last week. So I want to open by going back to the concept of resistance. But one of the ways that white supremacy is upheld, protected, reproduced, upkept, defended is through resistance. And like I said, as I began to speak earlier, I'm so lucky. Who would have thought my luck would show up so well last week, that we got perfect evidence of a wonderful example of resistance that you all got to bear witness to. So we're going to talk about it because, it doesn't get better than this. Let me just see what my next page is before I turn. And we know that we need to get really good at dealing with resistance. So we're going to talk about that next. I talk about obfuscation. Is that the conversation, there was an attempt to derail the conversation, right? Because what I was actually speaking about and saying, we have it on tape, as you all know, we record these, was actually not what was taken up in the argument, right? So there was a sub-argument, like a parallel other whole conversation that was happening where facts were presented. But the intention about the facts was to discredit the point that I was making. If you listened to what Andrew said, he offered facts to address the question about facts. That's what he did. He had them top of mind. He offered them. And I said to the facilitators here, I said, there's no reason why you can't speak. And I think what's more contentious here in this context is that silence has been such a robe of comfort for all of us that we're not, it's kind of like, this silent sideline watching voyeurism of all kinds of violent white supremacist resistance takedowns. And there's no reason why you can't open your mouth. So I invite you to do your job and address the issues when you see them. And in particular, if you notice, bear witness to, observe adults or children or youth being accosted by white supremacy, I would hope that you would not choose silence in that moment. That would be my hope for people who chose to work on behalf of children and youth for the rest of their lives. But we know the good Canadian way, right? And this is actually further part of my point about what the experience is of life in Canada versus life in the US as a Black person. And one of the things that Canada has going is its monarchy-like, polite way of existing, right? So no one wants to be rude, even in the face of white supremacy. Nobody wants to be rude. Permission, control the systems and the solutions. This is what you saw last week, right? I'm going to control what you will and won't say. I'm going to control how you even capture what the problem is. That's not the problem. This is the problem, right? I'm going to give you permission about how you define the problem and what your solutions are. This is the operations of white supremacy, and you saw it with your own eyes. It cannot be lost that it begins for white people with choosing to unlearn. That's where this all begins for white people, is choosing to unlearn. And where that choice is opted away from or out of, it is then on the institution to respond accordingly.
This is post-editing me making a correction. We know that Colleen Russell-Rawlins worked with Patrick Case when she was the director of the Peel School Board. In that same school board, she was considered a czar of race relations, engaging in questionable race-based social justice propaganda. And then I found a letter of her, or at least a representative of her under her direction at the TDSB, writing to her friend Patrick Case in his role at the ministry's Equity Secretariat, suspiciously demanding the very same kind of training that Patrick Case pioneered in his role early on in the 90s in the Equal Opportunities Office. She's asking specifically for 2S LGBTQ plus student staff training, anti-Black staff training, and anti-Asian staff training. This is the very same training, or money for the very same training, that funded KOJO Institute months later. The letter says, our Director of Education, Colleen Russell-Rawlins, has put in motion a 3-point plan, including the creation of internal staff team that includes external secondments to deepen learning in these two areas, the racism areas, I believe. To ensure effective development and implementation, we're seeking funding and resources from you to help bring this to fruition. And Patrick Case and the Equity Secretariat were more than happy to oblige. They sent millions. I'll just read another little part of the letter. It says, the board, meaning the TDSB, is committed to supporting educators in responding to historical and present-day acts of oppression and injustice as they arise. And as we saw in the training with KOJO Institute, exactly what kind of response they meant. Now, the TDSB, at the direction of Colleen Russell-Rawlins, have never released the report on these events. I'm sure it's been investigated, but they're keeping it from public view. There have been many FOIs sent into the TDSB for information on this case, and they keep covering it up. And frankly, it's probably because they're squarely at fault and they know it. And isn't it interesting that after the Grassy Narrows fiasco, Colleen suddenly and unexpectedly decided to retire? I don't think that's any coincidence. She's done enormous damage with the money that Patrick gave her, and she will never be held accountable for this complicity. But Patrick is still in position, and if this gets out to the public, he could face quite a backlash for his involvement in funding this kind of training that killed one of the staff members. So he has an interest in covering that up as well. So you see, the school board and the ministry, they know that the politics are biased in education. They know that it is extremist, and they know that at least one person has died as a direct result of what they're doing, not to mention the thousands who are terrified of speaking out against this. And they know that they have to keep covering this up so that the public don't know the details of what happened. So there's an incentive here for the Ministry of Education to make sure that someone like Patrick Case, who's been putting this in place for all these years, investigates the Toronto District School Board and sweeps it under the carpet. How many more people have to die? These are the same people who approve of these teachers who took kids to a Palestine protest. Would they approve it if a kid got beaten up at one of these protests? Would they hide it? They don't appear to have any brakes on this so-called progressive ideology. And I foresee some dangerous things happening in the future if they're not stopped. I don't think they'll stop on their own. I don't think they know how to stop on their own. I think they need to be made to stop. And just by the way, KOJO Thompson, at the time, she complained that she was the victim of racism after there was a massive public outrage aimed at her for causing the death of a beloved teacher.
Will not allow her, who is KOJO Thompson, to be lynched or chastised for leading the community groundwork that keeps our children's and youth's well-being accounted for. The pervasive labeling of Black women as intimidating and aggressive and threatening to white bodies is a deeply concerning trajectory. We are committed to ensuring that no Black woman or person feels unprotected or unsupported or is scapegoated. There is no doubt that racism exists and permeates Ontario's education system, and that our Black children, youth, Black educators all experience racism and the adverse effects of anti-Black racism every day within the education system. Many Black students literally and figuratively attempt to scratch the Black off their skin before they even get to the 3rd grade because the system makes them feel so invalidated.
Now, she is currently employed as a human capital consultant at Deloitte. I guess she didn't really lose out here. Videos like this take a reasonable amount of research to put together, and I am really hoping that it gets in front of the eyes of the people that really matter, our politicians. So I would really appreciate it if you clicked on the like button to get this out into the algorithm, and like and subscribe and press the notification button for the next video. I'll see you in the next one.